It really seems like we went through a time period where chief of staff became the go-to role that literally everyone had to have, wanted to be. Is it still on the upswing, do you think, Harry? Or do you think that people are like, what does it even mean?
Yeah, I mean, I was a chief of staff in 2019, and it's only been growing since. And now they're making AI chiefs of staff. So I guess that's a better signal than anything that people are
There you
interested in it.
go.
Yeah.
AI Chiefs of Staff. Welcome to Managed Chaos Podcast, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Katrina Purcell, and today we have the wonderful Harry Siggins on to talk to us about all things Chief of Staff. Harry is the founder of One Growth Studio, where he helps growing companies turn strategic plans into actual results, which in my experience is always a chief of staff's job, but we'll get more into that. As a former chief of staff at Quantive, an OKR software platform, Harry had the unique perspective of simultaneously running his company's internal OKR programs during rapid scaling, influencing the product's direction, and then also supporting clients with their OKR implementations. Based in Seattle, Harry works with growth stage tech companies to identify execution bottlenecks and coaches chiefs of staff looking to elevate their strategic impact. All right, Harry, that is a mouthful, but all things that I think anybody who's ever done a chief of staff role, probably their eyes started twitching when I said OKRs. But let's think about key questions that someone should ask in an interview to determine if the company really understands what they need from a chief of staff role.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the best question is, why are you hiring for this role right now? I think the hardest thing for anyone looking to get into a chief of staff job right now is they look at all the job descriptions and they look the same, but then they realize that when you're in the job, they never look the same. And that's why you get so many communities around this of, hey, I do this, but this person does that. And it makes it very confusing. And it's understandable why things are generalized in job descriptions, but I think that first question is, why this position and why now? Because I think you'll start to uncover, is it around, am I going to be helping work in the business, helping your teams, or am I working on the business? Am I working with the founder and sort of thinking about the next 12 months, 18 months? And I think both kind of give a different flavor to what to expect.
They do. There's also those roles where it's just that the founder's friend got a chief of staff and they heard it really changed the business and they've decided now they want one. And so it's sort of like a free for all. What do you want it to be? Which is a scary place. Scary, but exciting. Can be good. I entered a role like that. And you can kind of make it into what you want, but it takes a lot of work. And I think it helps to have had previous experience of what the role should be or what ideally it should look like. The trick that I found is that sometimes it's a glorified EA. Not an actual chief of staff. Have you figured out a good way to sniff that out?
Yes and no. I guess my experience was and this may be the case for the more, let's say, the working on the business working on the business side with the founders, a lot of chief of staffs end up being internal hires because they start to show that they can expand their role. If you start to see companies that are doing that or have opened up a position and you're in that company, and you can kind of get a sense of whether that is going to be the founder just has bandwidth issues, or maybe there's actually a real strategic role here. I think I think it's a tough thing to look for inherently, but I think you're right in that if, let's say, all you have is a job description to work with, I think if they're mentioning a lot about time, productivity, savings, it's likely going to involve a lot more of founder operations or office of the CEO operations, which is extremely valuable. But I think when we think about chief of staff and we think about, what we envision it to be, you want to find things that are talking about like building teams from scratch or aligning teams or leadership teams that have big personalities and just having someone be able to do that. If they're not speaking that language, it's likely either too much on the EA side or it's going to be a lot of work for one person to do, which means that maybe the company hasn't really filtered through what their expectations are.
That's a really great point. One of the questions that I like to ask is, do they have an EA and how long has that person been in seat?
Yeah.
Right? How familiar are they with the CEO? How is that relationship? What does that look like? Because it can give you a good idea in the interview process on whether or not, if that's working, then great. And there probably are a lot more strategic challenges for you to be able to tackle. So what is one practical technique that chiefs of staff can implement sort of immediately almost to cut through that organizational noise and kind of maintain focus? Because a lot of times you're coming into a company that's trying to do so many things. You're the person who kind of has to rein them back a little bit and say, hey, we really need to focus on a few things to be successful. How do you do that?
I think the best thing you can do is like kind of define your role in that context. So I think one of the best pieces of feedback that I got from the CEO was that my title should be Chief Challenger Officer, because my biggest value was just providing either an alternative perspective on something or just being able to kind of battle it to strengthen it further. And I think when people understand the expectation that you're there to do that job, whether it's challenge, whether it's to, rein people in, provide that focus, if they understand the expectation that that is your job, that is what a chief of staff is, that's perfect. Because I think what happens is a lot of us who are in this world know what it is. If you step out of chief of staff world, no one knows what you do. So if you walk into that organization, people don't understand your role. They never will. And that will continue to change. I joined when it was 20 people as a chief of staff. And every month I was essentially trying to explain to all the new hires we're bringing in what it is I do. I'm not Leo from West Wing, like all of these different things. So I think it's a constant reminder to people of like, here's what I do and here's how to work with me. I think it's a great way in your first week just to kind of outline what your mandate is. So.
And set the expectations.
Yep.
I had to do a presentation one time for a bunch of middle schoolers on what I did. And I said, I'm basically a kindergarten teacher for adults. And to adults, people used to say, so are you like the Wendy Rhodes?
Oh.
Yes, it's my job to get consensus and make things happen, regardless of the way with which we have to go about doing that. So a chief of staff role can be somewhat difficult to quantify your impact, because generally you have a hand in making a lot of things happen, but you're not always the face of making it happen, right? You're integrating cross-functional teams and making sure that balls don't get dropped or that communication is happening, that nothing is getting lost in translation. So when your work is kind of spanning all of those things to enable other things to happen, how do you quantify or demonstrate your impact?
Great question. And I think it's a lot of what people who are like writing their resumes are going through or are trying to figure out what that looks like, because they all end up looking the same, where it's like, all right, strategic initiatives, leadership team alignment, but what's the actual quantification of it is really hard to do. One of the things that I found the most helpful was, I forgot where I found it, but it was like this idea that if you track all those micro moments of wins throughout like a given week, of whether it was like a very tough leadership conversation that you were able to like manage through, or you helped influence some change in direction for this, or you helped a whole team work in a new way. If you track that over a monthly period or track it weekly over a few months, and then start to look back at the patterns, I think the most valuable thing that you can find is that although you may not be able to exactly quantify things, you'd be able to say how you influenced that change in quantity. So, for example, you maybe didn't sell, the millions of ARR that increased over the time you were there, but you can start to see the influence that you had in the approach the sales team or the go-to-market team had in their approach. And it's very hard to do in the moment. So if you start seeing that over the course of it, you can sort of see, oh, was I optimizing processes, or was I enabling the team, or was I simply finding better ways for them to work with products that led to that growth? So I think we, as chiefs of staff, we always forget about our wins. We like succeed and then we don't celebrate them. That's just like the floor has been raised and the bar is still as high. So this is a way to kind of track that over time in a really small way, that when you look back at things, and start to see all those patterns that you may have missed, that helps with at least bridging the gap of quantification of it. So
I think it also helps when you start to think about how to talk to your principal about areas where you might not be getting as much exposure that you'd want more exposure, or areas where you feel like, hey, there's probably room now for a full-time hire because the company has grown and the issues that you're dealing with in certain areas might actually, have exceeded your bandwidth because there's other things that you could prioritize. So I love that idea of kind of writing it down in the moment, as opposed to what we often do, which is sort of, oh God, your reviews are coming up. Let me sit down and try to remember all the things that happened and all the board meetings. And it can kind of get away from you.
Totally.
Because
Yeah.
especially so in my experience, I've had a few different experiences, but in one experience, the founder explicitly brought me on because he wanted someone who actually had the operational experience of running a company. That wasn't his forte. It wasn't his zone of genius. And so he kind of didn't want to deal with that. He wanted to continue with his founder-led selling, and he wanted the company to just sort of run in the background. And so it became very hard to sort of quantify, like, how do you actually quantify running an entire, organization or building an organization? And so at the end of the year, I'd have to say, this is what the go-to-market wasn't able to do. But guess what? This is how we actually implemented all of those customers. And this is how we were able to do that. You guys were out selling. It was great. But then we had to actually do something with what you sold.
Yeah. I think it also highlights like one problem, which is like standing out from others, which is if every chief of staff is doing very similar work work that's hard to kind of like summarize in a unique way, understanding how you're approaching these problems and being able to explain how you solve those problems. I think whether it's through, you're more strategic, you're more process oriented, you're more people oriented, I think it's kind of like there's an opportunity there to provide that perspective, and tracking that over a period of time allows you to see things that you wouldn't have normally seen on the surface that people would define you as. So it's like having an archetype of a chief of staff.
Yeah.
It's like building that can help with this as well. Even if you can't quantify it, people will understand what type of chief of staff are you. So.
And I do think when you start to think about making a move into chief of staff, right? Because you're not normally in college, you're like, I'm going to be a chief of staff when I grow up. I think when you think about your background, right? And what led you into the role, I think leaning heavily. So I was very heavily operations, sort of, go to market, tech oriented. So the skills that you have that led you into that role, I think leveraging those and really leaning into. So how about you? Like, what were the things that you kind of leaned heavily into? Or did you just sort of fall into the chief of staff role and you were like,
I think I leaned mostly so I came from like a consulting background. So I was trained to problem solve. And I was doing that in the consulting world, which is a little bit different. It's much more of a quantitative role when I was doing that job. But that taught me like how to communicate, how to problem solve any sort of issue. And that just leaned into like a very like higher level, like generalist opportunity. And so for something like going into a chief of staff, a lot of it was I've got a baseline level of ability to operate in different circumstances, but I know how to take in a very big, hairy problem and be able to solve it pretty easily.
Right.
So I'd say like the approach to problem solving was the thing that I aligned with. I had never really run a company before, but a lot of it was very much just like systems thinking. And that's what I was kind of drilled into my head for years before that. So
yes, that consulting background will do that for you.
Yeah, definitely.
So what is one counterintuitive move that you've seen make the biggest difference in sort of maintaining clarity as companies scale?
I think one that I tried that at Quantive that worked really well was, even though we hired more people to be able to do more things, it was actually reining in the focus even harder into a single problem, which I think a lot of companies end up wanting to do, but they don't, because they have, I have 6 executives, I've got hundreds of people, I can now do a lot of things. But that sounds good on paper that you can do a lot of things, but in reality, your teams have to work together. And if they're limited in capacity, how much can you actually get done? So that's going to change the business for the next 3, 6, 12 months. Yep. And so, we would institute like, okay, tactically, we're only going to have 1 OKR per team. And it's like, that sent everyone kind of like, whoa. I'm used to having 3. Excuse me, can I please have more? And
yes,
it was
they
like,
always
no.
want more. They always want more. It's not exhaustive enough. We need more.
Yeah, and I think that gives people comfort in knowing that there's a lot of stuff going on. But when you really hone in this idea of hyper focus and really make strategy what it should be, which is not the actual plan you're delivering, it's what you're not working on. I think that's something that like companies should lean in more. So like the more extensive opportunities you have, the less opportunities you should actually take on is my thing. So.
Yeah, the power of no. The power of deciding not to do something is such a real, and I think that's actually a very good place where chief of staff comes in, because you're able to look at everything in totality and kind of show the team back where they've spent their time and where things might not actually be beneficial. And so doing less even when you have more. It's probably one of the hardest things I think that anyone can do, even individually. But I love that. That's actually the perfect way to think about ending this episode. How can people find you?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So it'll be in.
Which is how we found each other, because we were posting about similar topics, similar challenges.
Yep. Yeah, LinkedIn's the best way, but I also have a website at 12growth.com if you want to learn more about the services I offer. But yeah, LinkedIn's where you're going to see most of the content that may resonate and find out more about me.
Perfect. And we will link all of that in the show notes. And the name for this, the podcast, Managed Chaos, actually came about because the CEO told me as a chief of staff, I managed chaos better than anyone that he'd ever met. And I think for most growth companies, that's a very real experience. The chaos breeds innovation, it breeds excitement, but it can also feel too chaotic unless someone is reining it in.
Yeah, the goal is controlled chaos. Like you don't want to eliminate it, but you want to make sure it's in control.
Exactly. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Managed Chaos Podcast. We really appreciate it. Hopefully everyone now wants to become a chief of staff. Feel free to reach out to either one of us and learn more about what that could look like. And we will see you on the next episode.